She was 30 years old, worth over $1 billion, and she had just made the worst mistake of her life, and she didn't even know it yet. In front of 23 executives, Vivian Redmont looked at the man sitting across the conference table and said the words that would eventually cost her company hundreds of millions of dollars. No real options, Ethan. You have a mortgage. You have a daughter to put through college. Men like you don't just walk away. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up and he left. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night, if you believe that integrity still matters and that real strength isn't always the loudest voice in the room, then hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. And after you watch this one, all the way to the end, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The 47th floor of Redmont Freight Group's Chicago headquarters was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small on purpose. It wasn't accidental. The architecture was deliberate soaring glass walls that reflected the city's skyline back at you like a mirror, polished concrete floors that clicked beneath expensive shoes, a reception area staffed by two young women who had clearly been selected as much for their composure as their competence, was original art on the walls. Not prints, not reproductions, actual original pieces, the kind that required a specialist to authenticate and an insurance policy most people would faint reading. Every morning, black cars arrived at the building's private entrance and deposited vice presidents, senior directors, and various executives onto the street like offerings. Most of them wore suits that cost more than a mortgage payment. Most of them drove home to houses in Winnetka or Lake Forest or Hinsdale, where their wives or husbands hosted dinner parties and their children attended schools with waiting lists. Ethan Marlowe arrived every morning in a 2014 Ford Explorer with a cracked dashboard and a Redmont employee parking tag hanging from the rearview mirror. He parked on level 3 of the employee garage, took the elevator up and walked through the glass lobby with his laptop bag over one shoulder and a lunch container in his other hand. He packed his own lunch because the executive dining room charged $14 for a sandwich, and he thought that was ridiculous. He wore the same rotation of dark slacks and button-down shirts, nothing tailored, nothing with a visible logo. On his left wrist, he wore an old Seiko watch, a simple, modest thing with a worn leather strap that his late wife, Caroline, had given him on his 28th birthday. He was 32 years old. Around Redmont's polished executive floor, where the currency was appearance and the culture rewarded performance of success over substance, Ethan was frequently invisible to everyone. The loading dock supervisors knew him by his first name and waved when he walked past. The data analysts in the basement operations center left his name off meeting requests because they knew he'd show up anyway if anything critical was happening. 3 of the senior account managers kept his direct number saved under a label. That wasn't his official title. They called him in their contacts simply the guy who fixes it. But to the people who occupied the corner offices and sat at the mahogany conference table on 47, he was the director of operational systems, a technical man, reliable, quiet, slightly too blunt in meetings for some people's comfort. And to 30-year-old Vivian Redmont, the CEO who had inherited the company from her father and transformed it into something far more aggressive and far more profitable in 4 years, Ethan Marlowe was something she had long since categorized and filed away. He was a man with responsibilities he couldn't afford to walk away from. She was wrong, but she wouldn't understand that for another 8 weeks. Most people at Redmont didn't know the full story of how the company had survived. 5 years earlier, before Vivian had taken the helm and before the aggressive expansion that had tripled the company's revenue, Redmont had been quietly bleeding to death. Not from scandal or mismanagement in the traditional sense, but from an operational problem that nobody on the executive floor had understood well enough to solve. Redmont's national logistics network, which moved goods across 41 states through a complex web of distribution centers, regional hubs, and carrier contracts had developed routing inefficiencies that were costing the company somewhere between $18 and $22 million annually in excess fuel costs, missed delivery windows, and penalty clauses buried in client contracts. The board had brought in 3 separate consulting firms. They had produced thick reports with expensive bindings and recommendations that had accomplished almost nothing. No, because none of them had understood what Ethan had understood from the first week he'd spent studying the problem. The issue wasn't driver performance. It wasn't carrier relationships. It wasn't even the contracts. It was the architecture of the system itself. Yes, Redmont was routing freight through a logic model that had been designed in 1998 and patched 17 times since. It was like trying to navigate a modern city using a map drawn before half the roads existed and then wondering why you kept arriving late. Ethan had spent 4 months building something different from scratch. He worked nights and weekends, using his own equipment in the spare bedroom of the house in Elmhurst that he shared with Caroline and their then 9-year-old daughter, Sadie. He had called it North Star, a routing architecture that integrated real-time carrier data, weather modeling, historical delay patterns, and predictive load balancing in a way that none of the existing enterprise logistics platforms did. He had approached Redmont's then CEO Vivian's father, Gerald Redmont, with a licensing proposal rather than an employment contract. Gerald, to his enormous credit, had recognized what he was looking at. The deal they reached was unusual. Ethan licensed North Star to Redmont and joined the company as an employee to oversee its implementation and ongoing development. The technology remained entirely Ethan's intellectual property. Marlowe Systems, the small company he'd incorporated before the conversation, retained full ownership. Redmont paid a licensing fee structured into Ethan's compensation package, and the terms included a 90-day transition clause if Ethan ever departed. Redmont had 90 days to either renegotiate a new licensing agreement or develop an alternative. Clause had seemed like a formality at the time. Gerald had even joked about it. Nobody had explained it clearly to Vivian when she took over. Perhaps someone had, and she hadn't considered it worth her attention. Vivian Redmont was, by most accounts, extraordinarily intelligent and strategically gifted. Yes, she was also, by the accounts of people who had worked closely with her, not always interested in details she had already decided were beneath her. Ethan had learned this about her within the first 8 months of her leadership. He had adapted. He had remained. He had told himself that it was manageable, that her aggressive instincts could be channeled productively, that the people depending on the operational systems he'd built, the 300 warehouse workers in Memphis, the dispatch teams in Phoenix, the dispatch teams navigating frozen interstates in January needed someone inside the building, looking out for them. Then one Tuesday morning in late October, Vivian walked into the 47th floor conference room and proposed cutting the operational budget by 18%. Conference room on 47 had a view that could genuinely stop a person's breath on a clear morning. Lake Michigan stretched out to the east like hammered silver, and on certain autumn days the light hit the water in a way that made the glass towers of the lakefront look like they were burning, quietly and beautifully, from the inside. It was the kind of view that made powerful people feel confirmed in their power. It was designed to do exactly that. Ethan rarely looked at it during meetings. He was looking at his laptop screen and at the numbers on it, and the numbers were not good. Vivian stood at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Sadie's first semester of college would. She had the kind of physical presence that filled rooms, tall, composed, dark hair, pulled back with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste time on things that didn't serve a purpose. Ethan had privately admitted to himself years ago, genuinely impressive in most of the ways that mattered for the job she was doing. In most of the ways. 18% across operational overhead, she said, clicking through a slide presentation that her CFO, Douglas Farrell, had prepared. The slides were clean and visually compelling in in the way that financial presentations often were when they were trying to make something painful look palatable. We're heading into peak shipping season, carrying costs we absorbed during expansion. The board wants to see margin improvement before the fiscal year closes. This is where we find it. There were 12 people in the room. 9 of them were nodding, along with varying degrees of sincerity. 2 were looking at their phones under the table. 1 was looking at his laptop and quietly doing math that did not agree with the slide. Ethan waited until she finished the presentation. He had learned the hard way over 6 years that interrupting Vivian mid-presentation was an exercise in humiliation. She did not appreciate being redirected in front of an audience. He had made that mistake twice, early in her tenure, and both times she had handled it in a way that was technical, professional, and practically personal. So he waited. Questions? Vivian asked, clicking back to the summary slide. Ethan said. The 9 nodding heads oriented toward him slightly. Vivian's eyes found him with the particular precision of someone who had been expecting his voice and had already prepared a response. In Ethan, the 3 distribution centers in Memphis, Harrisburg, and Reno are currently running maintenance reserves at 11.9%, 13% respectively, he said. He turned his laptop slightly, though he wasn't really showing it to anyone in particular. He just needed to look at the numbers when he talked about them. An 18% cut to operational overhead brings all 3 below the safety threshold that our carrier contract requires us to maintain. The Memphis contract specifically, which is our largest single client relationship on that corridor, has a clause requiring 60-day advance notice if our service capacity falls below agreed parameters. If we hit that threshold without notice, we're looking at either a penalty event or a renegotiation that they will use to extract better terms. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms got quiet when someone had said something that people wished they hadn't heard. Vivian's expression didn't change. This was one of her genuine skills, absolute facial control in situations where lesser executives telegraphed their reactions. Projecting a penalty event, she said, based on a threshold we're approaching, not one we've crossed. Based on a trajectory we've been on since Q2, Ethan said. If we cut reserves now, before peak season, we're not approaching the threshold. We cross it during the highest volume period of the year, when our capacity is already stretched, when carrier relationships are under the most stress, and when any service disruption is maximally visible to clients. Douglas has modeled this, Vivian said, gesturing toward the CFO. Douglas Farrell was 47 years old, had an MBA from Wharton, and had been hired because Vivian trusted his financial modeling and his willingness to execute her vision. He was not, Ethan had concluded, a bad man. He was a careful man who had learned which direction the wind blew from. The model accounts for seasonal variance, Douglas said, though the slight tension around his jaw suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the confidence being placed in him at this particular moment. The model doesn't account for the North Star routing load under peak conditions when maintenance reserves drop, Ethan said, aggressively. Just the way he always said things like he was reading information off a surface that was clearly visible to him, and he genuinely couldn't understand why others weren't seeing it. I've run those numbers. There's a compounding effect when capacity constraints hit the routing system at the same time. It's not theoretical. We saw a version of it in 2019 in the Southeast cluster. It was a different operational context, Douglas said. Different geography, same mechanics, Ethan said. Vivian set her presentation remote down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. Ethan, she said, I appreciate the diligence. The decision has already been reviewed at the board level. We're moving forward with the proposed reductions. He looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not even with frustration exactly, with the expression of someone who was staring at an approaching problem and calculating how long until impact. Can I submit a formal operational risk assessment before implementation? He asked. Of course, Vivian said. The words were permission. Tone was dismissal. Ethan submitted the assessment within 48 hours. 73 pages long. He had attached 3 separate financial models, a case study from the 2019 Southeast incident, carrier contract summaries with the relevant clauses highlighted. One-page executive summary written in language simple enough that nobody could claim confusion. 2 weeks passed. He received no response. He sent a follow-up to Douglas, who told him the assessment was under review. He sent a second follow-up to Vivian's executive assistant, who told him that the CEO had received the document and would follow up when appropriate. Another week passed, and then came the second meeting. The second meeting was smaller. Vivian, Douglas, the chief operating officer, a man named Roland Baxter, who had been brought in from a competing firm and who had the particular quality of accomplished men who had grown very skilled at surviving in rooms controlled by other people, and Ethan. It had been scheduled as a follow-up on operational budget implementation. Ethan had understood this to mean that there would be a conversation about his risk assessment. He was almost right about that. Vivian opened the meeting by confirming that the 18% operational reduction would proceed on the timeline originally proposed. She acknowledged, briefly and without warmth, that Ethan had submitted an assessment. Then she said, "I want to be direct about something." Ethan waited. "You've submitted 2 formal objections to this decision. You've copied department heads on documents that are. I want to be careful here, accurate in their content, but strategic in their timing and distribution." She folded her hands on the table. "We are 6 weeks from peak season. The last thing this leadership team needs is internal uncertainty being broadcast across operational management. I sent those documents to the people responsible for implementing the changes," Ethan said. "No. So they'd have the context they needed." "You sent them to create leverage," Vivian said. The room got a different kind of quiet then. Ethan looked at her. "That's not accurate. You have a mortgage on your house in Elmhurst," Vivian said. Her voice was still professionally level. This was somehow worse than if she'd raised it. "Your daughter is 14. College is 4 years away. You've been here 6 years, which means you're vested, but you're not at a level where walking away is comfortable or realistic." Roland Baxter had stopped looking at his notepad. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who wanted to be in a different room. Douglas was looking at his hands. "I'm saying this," Vivian continued, "because I think your judgment is being influenced by factors that have nothing to do with the operational data. I think you're afraid of what happens to your position if this season goes badly. And I think that fear is driving you to protect your relevance here, at the expense of organizational unity." Ethan sat with that for a moment. The watch on his wrist, Caroline's watch, caught a slant of afternoon light from the window. "My objections are in the documents I submitted," he said. "They stand on their own without anything personal attached to them. If you disagree with the analysis, I'd welcome a specific response to the data." "The decision has been made," Vivian said. "Then I'd like that in writing," Ethan said. So the record is clear about what was recommended and what was decided. Something shifted in Vivian's expression, a slight tightening. She had expected the financial vulnerability argument to land differently. She had expected him to absorb it, recalibrate, and fall into line. That was what usually happened when she reminded people of their circumstances. Cruelly, she would not have described it as cruel. Practically, she was reminding him of the practical realities of his situation, and those reminders almost always produced useful compliance. "You want your objection on the record," she said. "I want accurate documentation of the decision-making process," Ethan said. "Yes, fine." She said it the way you say a word when you're already planning the next 3 moves. "And if you find that you cannot support this direction as a member of the leadership team, then perhaps we should discuss whether this role continues to be the right fit." This was the invitation. Ethan recognized it. He had seen her use this mechanism before with 2 other senior managers, the implied suggestion that loyalty and agreement were the same thing, delivered in a tone that dared you to contradict it. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Is that a hypothetical, or are you asking me to leave?" Vivian's chin came up a fraction of an inch. "I'm asking you to decide whether you can align with this team's direction. I've given you my professional assessment," Ethan said. "If you're asking me to endorse a decision I believe is going to hurt this company, I'm not able to do that. If you're asking me to stop doing my job honestly, I'm not able to do that either." He paused. "If the condition of staying here is that I pretend the numbers say something they don't, then yes. I think you're right that this role isn't the right fit." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Vivian said, "Then perhaps you should consider your options." Ethan said, "I will." He stood, pushed his chair back, and walked to the door. Roland Baxter's pen had stopped moving entirely. Douglas was looking at the table. Ethan pulled the door open, stepped through it, and walked back to his office. His office was not large. It had never been large, which had always seemed like an institutional judgment on his importance. No, although Ethan had long since stopped caring. He had a window that faced north, not the spectacular lake view of the corner offices. Yes, intervened, but a perfectly reasonable view of the city that he had spent 6 years occasionally stopping to look at during long nights when the routing systems were giving him problems. Stood in the middle of the office for about 15 seconds. Then he went to his desk and found the cardboard box that his new printer had come in 3 weeks earlier and that he had kept because he hated throwing away useful boxes. He put Sadie's photograph in first. It was a 4x6 he'd taken at the lakefront last summer, her laughing at something off camera, with particular unguarded laugh she had, that she was starting to hide more around other people, now that she was 14. He wrapped it in a piece of paper towel he found in his desk drawer and set it carefully at the bottom of the box. His notebooks, 3 of them, spiral-bound, filled with his handwriting. No, none of it proprietary company information, all of it personal thinking and technical notes that belonged to him. Caroline's fountain pen. A Mont Blanc that she had saved up for over 2 months to buy him when he'd gotten his first real professional contract, because she knew he preferred writing by hand when he was working out a problem. He had been using it so long that the grip was perfectly worn to his hand. 2 books from the shelf, a battered copy of a logistics textbook that had been his when he was studying. A novel somebody had given him as a gift, once that he had never finished but kept meaning to. He opened his laptop, connected to the company server, and spent 45 minutes completing something he had actually begun drafting 6 weeks earlier, a comprehensive transition document. Every active project, every open decision thread, every vendor relationship with its relevant contact and current status, every incomplete task with its current stage and what would be needed to move it forward. He'd begun building it 6 weeks ago, not out of anger, not out of calculation at that point, but because Ethan was the kind of person who experienced a vague professional anxiety about leaving things undone. He had built transition documents before for lesser handoffs. This one had started as a habit and had quietly grown into something more complete. He uploaded it to the shared drive with a note to his assistant and a copy flagged to HR. Then he picked up the cardboard box. He walked through the 47th floor toward the security desk near the elevators. A few people looked up as he passed. Project manager named Keisha, who had worked with him for 4 years, said Ethan, and then stopped, because the cardboard box made the sentence unnecessary. He stopped at the security desk. A guard named Marcus, who had worked the morning desk for 3 years, and who had shared Ethan's irritation about the executive parking situation on at least 6 separate occasions, looked at the box, and then at Ethan's face, and then at the box again. "You doing all right?" Marcus said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Good to see you, man." He surrendered his badge. Marcus scanned it, deactivated it, and placed it in the tray, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this procedure many times, but who was not entirely comfortable doing it in this particular instance. Ethan picked up his cardboard box. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the parking garage. The elevator doors closed. Vivian Redmont, who had this last piece of it from the hallway, outside the conference room, where she'd gone to take a call, lowered her phone and looked at the closed elevator doors for a moment. She turned back to her call. She assumed, with the confidence that had always served her so well, that she would hear from him by the end of the week. Once the financial reality settled in, Once the mortgage payment came due and the college fund calculations caught up with the boldness of the moment. She had seen bolder exits than this from people with better safety nets. They always came back. She put the phone back to her ear. In the parking garage on level 3, Ethan set the box on the passenger seat of his Ford Explorer, adjusted the rear view mirror out of habit, and pulled into the late afternoon Chicago traffic. His phone buzzed. A text from Sadie. "Are you picking me up today or is it Grandma?" He typed back with one hand at a red light, "Me. Leaving now. Hungry?" 3 seconds. Always he set the phone on the seat beside the box. The fountain pen shifted slightly in the box as he turned onto Michigan Avenue, its cap glinting in the low October sun. He would call his attorney tonight, after dinner. He had already thought through most of what needed to happen next. Yes, he'd intervened. He had been thinking through it honestly for longer than he would have admitted to anyone at Redmont. Vivian's meeting today had not created his decision. It had simply removed the last reason he'd been giving himself to delay it. He stopped at another red light. Somewhere behind him, on the 47th floor of the building he'd just left, Redmont's general counsel was pulling a contract document from his filing system, the original licensing agreement, the one Gerald Redmont had signed. The one with the 90-day transition clause, because someone on the executive team had asked him, for the first time in 4 years, to please review the terms under which North Star Logistics architecture was actually held. The light turned green. Ethan drove toward his daughter. The call from Redmont's general counsel came at 7:14 in the morning, 2 days after Ethan had surrendered badge to Marcus at the security desk. Paul Greer had been Redmont's general counsel for 11 years. He was a careful, methodical man who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and who had the professional habit of never sounding alarmed on the phone, no, regardless of what was actually happening. Ethan had always respected him for that, and for the fact that Paul was one of the few people at the executive level who read every word of every contract he was responsible for. Paul had apparently spent a significant portion of the previous day reading a particular contract very carefully. Ethan was standing at the kitchen counter in his house in Elmhurst, still in yesterday's sweatshirt, making coffee. Sadie had left for school 40 minutes earlier. After eating half a piece of toast and spending the remainder of breakfast on her phone, in a way that he had decided not to comment on because he had bigger things to think about, and she was 14, and some battles weren't worth the morning. Looked at the caller ID, picked up Paul, Ethan. A pause. A dramatic pause. Paul didn't do dramatic. A reading glasses sliding down his nose pause, the kind he made when he was organizing something complicated into clear language. "I've been reviewing the original licensing agreement. The Marlowe Systems Agreement. From 2018. Okay, Ethan said. I want to make sure I'm reading the transition clause correctly." Another pause. The 90-day provision. In the event of separation from the employee arrangement, the licensing terms revert to a standalone commercial negotiation. "Is that your reading of it?" "That's what it says," Ethan said. Coffee maker finished. He poured a cup. He could hear Paul breathing on the other end of the line in the careful way that people breathed when they were trying not to let their breathing say anything. "And the intellectual property," Paul said. "North Star. The architecture itself. That's retained entirely by Marlowe Systems under this agreement." "Always has been," Ethan said. "Yes." Paul cleared his throat. "I'm aware of that. I want you to know that I was not consulted before the meeting on Tuesday. I want to be clear about that." Ethan picked up his coffee. "Paul, the transition document you submitted. Thorough. I've read it twice. Good." Another pause. "This one longer. Ethan, is there a conversation to be had here? About terms? Before the 90 days start running?" Ethan set his coffee down on the counter. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the grass had gone brown, and the oak tree in the corner had dropped about half its leaves onto the lawn. He hadn't raked yet, and probably wouldn't get to this week. "Right now, Paul," he said. "I need some time." Of course, Paul's voice was even and professional, but underneath it was something that might have been the sound of a man who had just looked at a very large number. and was still calculating what it meant. "I'll be here when you're ready." They hung up. Ethan stood in his kitchen for a while, drinking his coffee, looking at the leaves in the backyard. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. Her name was Sandra Cho, and she had been Ethan's attorney since the original Marlowe Systems Incorporation in 2017. She was 53 years old, operated out of a two-lawyer firm in Oak Park, and was the kind of attorney that large firms consistently underestimated until they were across the table from her in a negotiation. Ethan had chosen her because Gerald Redmont's corporate lawyers had tried to complicate the original licensing agreement with 17 pages of what Sandra had called, with magnificent professional dryness, aspirational language designed to obscure the fundamental terms. Sandra had removed all 17 pages and replaced them with 4. Gerald's lawyers had objected. Gerald had overruled his own lawyers because the 4 pages said exactly what both parties had agreed to and the 17 had not. "I saw your text last night," Sandra said when she picked up. "Talk to me." He talked to her for 40 minutes. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "The 90-day clock started the day you surrendered your badge?" "Day before yesterday," Ethan said. "Then we have 88 days to decide what the new commercial relationship looks like." "Doesn't look like." She paused. "You've been preparing for this." It wasn't entirely a question. "I've been thinking about it for a while," Ethan said. "How long is a while?" He looked at the oak tree. "About 6 months." Sandra said the sound she made when a client told her something that explained a lot of things she had been wondering about. "Okay, first thing, don't initiate contact with Redmont. Let Paul come to you. Second thing, I want to look at the transition document you submitted before anyone there starts claiming ownership of anything in it." She paused. "How are you doing?" "Actually." Then Ethan thought about that question in the honest way she'd asked it. "I'm okay," he said. "Ask me in a week." "Deal," Sandra said. "I'll have a letter out to Paul by end of day, formally establishing the commencement of the transition period and the terms under which Marlowe Systems will conduct it." He thanked her and hung up. He finished his coffee, standing at the counter. He rinsed the cup, put on a jacket, and drove to the small storage unit in Addison, where he had been keeping, over the past several months, sets, the equipment, and early documentation for what would eventually become the second version of Marlowe Systems. He had a lot of work to do. On the 47th floor of Redmont Freight Group, the morning of that same day had begun badly and declined from there. Vivian had arrived at 7:30 and found Paul Greer's email summarizing the licensing situation in her inbox. She read it twice, standing at her desk without taking her coat off, which was a behavior her executive assistant had learned to recognize as a signal to hold all non-critical calls. She called Paul into her office at 7:45. "Walk me through it," she said. Paul walked her through it. Yes, he was thorough and careful, and twice she interrupted him with questions that he answered without letting her interruption make him lose his place, which was one of his best qualities. When he finished, Vivian stood at her window and looked at the lake for a moment. The water was gray and cold and completely indifferent. "He retains the IP," she said. "Entirely," Paul said. "Marlowe Systems has held it since the original agreement. Licensing arrangement. The licensing was always separate from his employment contract. The two were intentionally distinct. And the 90 days. Standard commercial licensing transition. After 90 days without a new agreement, we're in breach of the current terms and would need to either renegotiate or migrate away from the North Star architecture." Vivian turned from the window. How long would migration take? Paul had been expecting this question. He had asked the same question of Redmont's chief technology officer the previous afternoon, and the answer had not pleased him. "Our technology team's preliminary estimate," he said carefully, "is between 14 and 22 months. For a full migration to an alternative routing system. And that estimate assumes we can find an alternative that meets our operational scale." That's outside my area," Paul said. "But my understanding from the conversation with he is that North Star is not easily replaced. It was built specifically for our network." Vivian sat down. This was notable. Vivian almost never sat down during a standing conversation. It suggested that the weight of what Paul had said required more physical support than a standing posture allowed. She should have been told about this clause when she took over. Paul said, and then added quickly, an accusation. Just relevant context. I was told, Vivian said. Paul adjusted his reading glasses. I was given the overview of the IP arrangement when I came in, Vivian said. I understood that North Star was licensed. I understood the terms were favorable. She paused. I did not fully register the transition clause implications. This was the most honest thing she would say about this situation for a long time, and she knew it even as she said it. She'd insisted, and he said it anyway, because she was alone with her general counsel, and because the alternative was pretending. She hadn't known something she had partially known, which was a kind of lie that Paul Greer, after 11 years, would have seen through immediately. Okay, Paul said. See, he said it simply, and moved on, which was one of the other reasons she kept him. Sandra Cho reached out this morning. She represents Marlowe Systems. She's formally notified us that the transition period has begun, and that her client will honor all obligations under the existing terms through the 90-day window. That's more than he had to do, Vivian said. Yes, Paul said. It is. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific quality of two people who were both thinking the same thing and neither of whom was quite ready to say it out loud. Vivian said, set up a meeting with Roland and Douglas this afternoon and pull Ethan's full employment history, the operational reports he submitted in the last 6 months, and the risk assessment from 2 weeks ago. The risk assessment that wasn't responded to, Paul said. Yes, Vivian said. That one. The meeting that afternoon lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes, and it was not a comfortable 2 hours and 19 minutes. Douglas had brought updated financial models that, when run with the assumptions Ethan had outlined in his risk assessment, produced numbers that were significantly worse than the numbers on Vivian's original presentation slides. Douglas presented them in the tone of a man who had been quietly hoping these numbers would turn out differently, and was now in the position of confirming they had not. Roland Baxter, who had spent 15 years in operations at a competing logistics company before Vivian had recruited him, listened to Douglas's presentation and then said something that nobody in the room had asked him to say, but that everyone needed to hear. Ethan's assessment was correct. I've reviewed it. The Memphis threshold issue is real. If we implement the cuts on the current timeline, we're going to have a service event during peak season. Are going to. Vivian looked at him. You reviewed it. This morning, Roland said. He was not defensive about it. Roland Baxter had survived 15 years in corporate operations by being practical, when being practical was the only move that actually worked. I should have reviewed it when he submitted it. I didn't push hard enough on that. Why not? Vivian asked. The question was direct and not entirely fair, and Roland knew it, and he answered it anyway. Because I thought the budget pressure was going to override the operational concern, regardless of what the assessment said. And I didn't want to spend political capital on a fight that was already decided. The room was quiet. Vivian looked at the financial model on the screen. Then she looked at Roland. Then she looked at the risk assessment document that Paul had placed in front of her 73 pages, tabs marking the relevant sections, the executive summary on top. She had not read it when Ethan submitted it. She read it now, or at least the first 20 pages of it. She read with the focused, efficient reading she applied to every document that actually required her attention. And as she read, the room waited, because Vivian reading in silence was not something anyone interrupted. After 20 minutes, she set the document down. What's the damage if we pause the cuts? She said. Question. A calculation being completed aloud. Douglas ran the numbers. The answer was painful but survivable. Delaying the operational cuts until after peak season and implementing them selectively rather than across the board would sacrifice the margin improvement she had promised the board. But it would not produce the crisis that the original timeline risked. The board presentation, Vivian said. I'll handle the board, Vivian said, answering her own half-formed question. See, she said it with the particular flat certainty of someone who had handled difficult board conversations before, and knew she would handle this one, and didn't want to discuss it further. There's still the North Star issue, Paul said, regardless of the operational decision. Vivian said. She did know. The operational crisis was, in the short term, manageable. The North Star situation was something else, because the question of what Redmont's national logistics network looked like without Ethan Marlowe's routing architecture at its center was not a question that had a comfortable answer. The longer Vivian sat with it, the less comfortable it became. She had spent 4 years running this company on the quiet assumption that Ethan would always be there, because she valued him, or not only because of that, but because she had categorized him as the kind of person who stayed, who packed his lunch and drove his old SUV and collected his paycheck and stayed, because what else would a man like that do? It was a category she had built out of incomplete information and the particular arrogance of someone who had grown up with money and had therefore never fully understood what it meant to build something from nothing and choose to stay because you believed in the work, not because you had no other option. She had made a significant analytical error. She did not say this out loud. She was not yet ready to say it out loud. But she thought it, sitting in that conference room with the gray lake visible through the glass, and it sat in her chest with the specific discomfort of a truth that has no constructive exit. Reach out to Sandra Cho, she told Paul, when the meeting finally ended. I want to understand what a new commercial agreement would look like. Paul nodded. I'll call her tomorrow. Call her tonight, Vivian said. The week that followed was in various ways educational for everyone involved. Vivian paused the operational cuts, citing a need for a revised implementation timeline. The internal memo she sent was carefully worded. To his credit, Roland distributed it without commentary, and Douglas presented the revised financial projections to the relevant department heads without anyone explicitly being required to acknowledge what had caused the revision. The operational team was collectively and professionally gracious about not saying "we told you so," largely because the people who would have been most justified in saying it knew better than to say it, and the people who hadn't known anything either way were mostly confused about what had actually happened. 3 days after Ethan's departure, a client relationship manager named Diane Torres received a call from the account director at Cartwright Distributing, which was Redmont's third largest client and one of the 4 accounts that ran entirely on North Star optimized routing corridors. The account director's name was Kevin Chu, and he had a direct, not unfriendly manner that came noticeably less warm when the conversation reached its point. I heard Ethan Marlowe left Redmont, Kevin said. Diane, who was 31 and had been working this account for 2 years, and had specifically been told by her manager that the Cartwright relationship was stable, handled this with good professional composure. There have been some personnel changes, yes. Ethan personally worked through our spring supply chain disruption 2 years ago, Kevin said, when the interstate closures in Tennessee backed up our entire eastern distribution line. He spent 11 days on that problem, weekends included. Our CEO still talks about it. A pause. Is North Star going away? Absolutely not, Diane said, which was technically true at that specific moment, and which she immediately went to her manager about the instant the call ended. Her manager went to Roland. Roland went to Vivian. Vivian looked at the account file for Cartwright Distributing. $47 million in annual contract value. Due in 4 months. Then she looked at the account files for the 3 other major clients that Diane's team flagged as having similar North Star dependencies. Combined annual contract value, $212 million. She looked at this number for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Paul. How are the conversations with Sandra Cho going? She said. She's professional, Paul said carefully. She's not giving us much. They're not in a hurry. They're not in a hurry because they know we are, Vivian said. Would be my assessment. Yes. She thought for a moment. I want to speak to Ethan directly. Paul paused. Sandra may prefer to keep communication through counsel. I'm not asking her, Vivian said. I'm asking to speak to Ethan. Find out if he's willing. Paul made the call. Sandra, to everyone's mild surprise, relayed the message to Ethan and came back the next morning with an answer. He would meet at Redmont headquarters, not at a lawyer's office. At a coffee shop on Oak Street in the Gold Coast. At 8:30 in the morning on a Thursday, and he would have 45 minutes. Vivian agreed to these terms without negotiating them. She also agreed to come alone, which Sandra had specified and which Vivian had expected, and which she found privately, way she wouldn't have admitted to Douglas or Roland, slightly uncomfortable. She was accustomed to meetings with support around her, with people positioned to take notes, to defer to her, to confirm her read of the room by their presence. The prospect of sitting across a small table from Ethan Marlowe, with nobody else, in the conversation, felt different from the way she usually positioned herself in difficult exchanges. She showed up 4 minutes early. She ordered a black coffee. She was sitting at a corner table when Ethan came through the door at 8:29, wearing the same style of dark slacks and a flannel-lined jacket she'd never seen in the office because it was the kind of jacket you wore on weekends. He wasn't dressed for a meeting. He was this to be a meeting. He was dressed like a person who had been out running errands and stopped for coffee. Carried nothing, no bag, no laptop, no files. He ordered a coffee at the counter and brought it to the table and sat down across from her. Vivian, he said. Thank you for coming, she said. Sure, he said. They sat with their coffees for a moment. Vivian had prepared for this conversation. She had thought through what she would say, how she would approach it, how to frame the conversation in a way that was honest but also strategic. She had done this because she was fundamentally a strategic person, and the preparation had felt necessary and appropriate. Sitting across from Ethan in an ordinary coffee shop, she found that the prepared version of the conversation felt suddenly poorly suited to the actual room. She said, I owe you an apology for what I said in the meeting. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. What I said about your mortgage and your daughter, Vivian continued, was out of line. I was trying to make a management argument about alignment, and I used personal information to do it. It was wrong. Ethan looked at her steadily, not coldly, just steadily, with the same even quality he brought to everything. Quality that she had interpreted for years as a kind of low-grade stubbornness, but that she was beginning to recognize as something closer to the absence of performance. He wasn't performing anything at this table. He never had. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, slightly thrown by the simplicity of it. I accept the apology, he said, but that's not why I'm here. I know. She wrapped her own hands around her coffee cup. Outside, a bus went by, and a woman with a stroller navigated around a sandwich board on the sidewalk with the practiced efficiency of a city person who had done this 10,000 times. Operational situation, Vivian began. You paused the cuts, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled in the industry the way it always traveled in tight professional networks through people who knew people who had been on the calls. Yes, she said. Roland got there, Ethan said. There was no satisfaction in how he said it. Just information. He did, Vivian said. He should have gotten there sooner. I should have read your assessment when you submitted it. Ethan picked up his coffee. He looked out the window for a moment. Outside, the morning was cold and clear, and the Gold Coast sidewalks had the thin, bright quality of late autumn in Chicago, where the season was beautiful and exhausting, and you knew winter was walking toward you with its shoulders squared. What do you want, Vivian? She looked at him. I want you to come back. He didn't say anything. Name a number, she said. Whatever you need to make it work. We can restructure your role. To give you full operational authority. Remove the budget constraint on your reporting line. It's not about the money, he said. It can be about the money if that helps, she said, and she meant it practically, dismissively. But she saw from the slight change in his expression that it had landed wrong. It's not about the money, he said again. It was never about the money. I made a good salary. The licensing terms were fair. Wasn't sitting in my car on the drive home calculating whether I could squeeze more out of you. Then what? I was sitting in my car thinking about whether there was any version of tomorrow where I walked into that building and said something honest and had it actually matter. He looked at her. Angry. Something beyond anger, or maybe before it, the place on the other side of anger where a person has burned through all the heat and arrived at something cooler and clearer. Wasn't. There hadn't been for a while. You told me I had no options, and you thought that was going to keep me in line. You didn't understand that what you were actually doing was telling me you'd never respected the reasons I'd stayed. Vivian listened to this. She was 30 years old, and she was worth more money than most people would see in 3 lifetimes, and she ran a company that employed 11,000 people across the country. And she was sitting in a coffee shop on Oak Street being told, plainly as anyone had ever told her anything, that she had broken something she hadn't understood she was holding. I understand that, she said quietly. She said it because it was true, and because she was alone in this conversation, and because the prepared version of what she'd been going to say had dissolved somewhere around the 3rd sentence. I know you do, Ethan said. He wasn't being cruel about it. That's why I agreed to meet. She looked at him. But you're not coming back. He shook his head. Not with drama. Just no. What does a commercial agreement look like? She said. North Star, what are your terms? Sandra will talk to Paul about terms, he said. That's their job. I'm asking you what you need, she said. Before it becomes a legal negotiation, I'm asking you what a fair arrangement looks like. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense, not comfortable at all, that he was deciding how honest to be with her, and that the decision was not simple. Market rate for the license, he said. Real market rate, not the arrangement your father and I built when I needed the stability, and he needed the technology. What North Star would command in an open negotiation with a company of Redmont's size. He looked at her. It's not a punitive number. It's just an accurate one. And Marlowe Systems operates independently, he said. Completely, he said. No exclusivity, no operational involvement from my end beyond the technical support specified in the agreement. No presence at 47. That's going to cost us, she said. Yes, he said. He said it without apology, not because he was trying to be hard about it, but because they were past the point where soft language served either of them. Picked up her coffee. It had gone slightly cool. She drank it anyway. Is there anything that would change the answer on coming back? She said. She asked, knowing what the answer was. She asked it anyway, because she needed to hear it said clearly, needed to understand the perimeter of the situation completely. Ethan thought about this. He seemed to actually think about it, which she hadn't entirely expected. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and she had the sudden and unlikely image of him at a kitchen table in a house in Elmhurst, packing a 14-year-old's lunch. And the image was so far from everything that surrounded her in her ordinary days that it felt almost disorienting. He said, not to working for you. No, she nodded once. They finished their coffees. When they stood to leave, Vivian said, for what it's worth, and I understand, if it's not worth much, I think you were right. About the cuts, about the Memphis situation, about all of it. Ethan pulled on his jacket. He looked at her with the steady, unhurried expression that she had finally stopped trying to read as something other than what it was. A man who said what he meant and waited to see what you did with it. He said, that's the part that was never the problem. He walked to the door, and then he was outside on Oak Street. Then he was walking east with his jacket collar turned up against the November wind off the lake. And Vivian stood at the counter for a moment with her empty coffee cup in her hand before she set it down and walked out into the cold morning herself. Her car was waiting at the curb. She sat in the back seat for a moment before telling the driver to go. $212 million in contract exposure. 14 to 22 months for a migration that might not even be technically feasible. Peak shipping season, beginning in 4 weeks. A board that was going to want answers that she was going to have to provide. Cross-town storage unit in Addison that she had never seen and would never see. Ethan Marlowe was already at his folding table, with his laptop and his notebooks and Caroline's fountain pen, building the company he should have been running for the past 6 years, in the quiet and unhurried manner of a man who had finally stopped waiting for permission. The driver pulled into traffic. Vivian looked out the window at the city going past. She had built something real here. She knew that. She had taken her father's company and tripled its revenue and expanded into markets he'd never tried. And there were 11,000 people with jobs because of decisions she had made. That was real. That counted. But somewhere in the calculation, she had run on Ethan Marlowe, the single father with the mortgage and the old watch and the daughter approaching college. She had made an error she hadn't caught until too late. Kind of error that came from being very good at reading balance sheets and not good enough at reading the particular kind of person who stays not because they have to, but because they've decided it still means something. She'd mistaken the decision for the inability to make another one. She wouldn't make that particular mistake again. It was a poor consolation for the situation she was in, and she knew that too. Sitting in the back of the car, while Chicago scrolled past the window and peak shipping season counted down its weeks with the indifferent precision of a freight schedule that waited for no one. Peak shipping season arrived, the way it always arrived, not gradually. With warning, no, all at once, this like a door being thrown open in the middle of winter, and everything cold and loud rushing in simultaneously. The first week of November brought volume increases across Redmont's network that were, by historical standards, entirely normal. Expected, planned for. The problem was that the planning had been done under assumptions that Ethan's risk assessment had identified as dangerously optimistic. And while Vivian had paused the full 18% budget cut after the Oak Street meeting, she had not paused it entirely. She had implemented a modified version 12% instead of 18%, phased across the highest volume corridors, with language in the internal documentation, suggesting the reduction was a strategic reallocation rather than a cut, which was the kind of language that made finance people feel better and made operational people quietly furious. Roland Baxter had accepted the modified version because it was better than the original, and because he understood the board pressure Vivian was navigating, and because he was a practical man who had learned which hills were worth dying on. But he had also quietly told his two most experienced operations managers, a woman named Patricia Ossie in Memphis and a man named Greg Villanueva in Reno, to flag anything that looked wrong immediately, through the standard reporting chain but directly to him. Patricia flagged something on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November. She called Roland at 4:15 while he was still in the office. "Carrier buffer in Memphis," she said. Patricia was 51 years old and had been running distribution center operations for longer than some of Redmont's current executives had been out of college. She had a direct, unhurried phone manner that Roland had learned to take very seriously, because Patricia did not call unnecessarily. "We had a capacity event this morning on the Southern Corridor. Minor, we managed it, but the reserve margin we needed to manage it, we don't have that margin anymore under the current budget." "How close?" Roland said. "Close enough that I want it documented," Patricia said. "If it happens again next week, when the pre-Thanksgiving volume spike hits, I don't know that we can absorb it the same way." Roland thanked her and ended the call. Then he sat at his desk for a moment, looking at his screen, calculating. He went to Vivian's office. She was still there. Vivian was almost always still there at 4:30, which was one of the things people said about her when they were being complimentary, and also one of the things they said about her when they were being something else. "This had a capacity event today," Roland said. Vivian looked up from her screen. "Managed this time," Roland said. "Yes." She looked at him in the particular way she looked at people when she was assessing how much weight to assign their concern. It was a practiced look, calibrated and efficient, and Roland had been on the receiving enough times to know that what came next would tell him a great deal about where her head was. "What do you need?" she said. "I need authorization to restore the Memphis reserve margin to pre-cut levels," Roland said. "Just Memphis. Just through December. That reverses the Q4 projection." "Yes," said he. Didn't apologize for it. He had learned from watching Ethan that you didn't apologize for numbers. It does. Vivian looked at her screen. She looked at it for long enough that Roland remained standing without speaking, which took some discipline, because the silence had weight. She said. Roland nodded. He turned to leave. Roland, Vivian said. He stopped. Is Reno in the same position? He paused. Getting there. Fix Reno too, she said. Before he could respond, I know what it does to the projection. Fix it anyway. He fixed it. Both corridors restored to operational reserve levels that Ethan had, 73 pages ago, specified as minimum safe thresholds. The board projection took a hit that Vivian would have to explain at the December meeting, and she was already composing the explanation in the back of her mind with the particular efficiency of someone who had presented bad news to boards before and knew that the framing mattered almost as much as the number itself. The news that came from a different direction, entirely the kind of news that didn't come from operational reports or financial models, was the kind she hadn't prepared framing for. Came from a man named Charles Whitfield. Charles Whitfield was 64 years old and the CEO of Whitfield Industrial Supply, which was Redmont's single largest client, responsible for approximately $90 million in annual freight contracts. He and Gerald Redmont had known each other since the 1980s, had played golf together for 3 decades, and had maintained the kind of business relationship that was built on handshakes before it was built on contracts, which meant it was extremely valuable and also slightly more fragile than it looked from the outside. Vivian had met Charles Whitfield 4 times. He was polite to her in the manner of an older businessman who had decided to give the next generation a fair trial before rendering judgment, which was the best she could say about their relationship. Called her directly on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual enough in itself. Charles generally communicated through his procurement team that when his name appeared on her phone, Vivian picked up on the first ring. Charles, she said. Vivian. His voice had the particular texture of a man who spent a lot of time outdoors, and not a lot of time softening what he was about to say. I'm going to be straight with you, because I think you'd prefer that. I would, she said. I heard Ethan Marlowe left your company. Way he said it, not left the way people left jobs, not with the casual professional distance of a business transaction, but the way you said someone had left a place that had depended on them, specifically told Vivian several things at once, and none of them were comfortable. He did, she said. We're in a transition period. Is North Star going with him? She paused for exactly 1 second too long. We're in active commercial negotiations, she said. The service continues through the transition period. Vivian. He said her name the way older men said the names of younger people when they wanted to skip the diplomatic layer and get to the thing. Ethan Marlowe personally managed the recovery of our Eastern distribution line in April of last year. That story? I'm aware there was... He drove to our Memphis facility, Charles said. Sent someone. Drove himself. Spent 9 days working through a problem that 2 of our own logistics consultants had looked at and couldn't crack. He didn't bill us for it. He said it was part of the relationship. Charles paused. I've been in business for 40 years. You know how often somebody does that? Charles, I'm not asking for assurances, he said. I'm telling you something. I'm telling you something so you understand where my next question is coming from. My procurement team is going to reach out to your people about the renewal. When they do, I want to know that the operational relationship we have with Redmont, the one that's actually working, not the one on paper, is still there in some form. We're working on it, Vivian said. Good, Charles said. Because the alternative, and I say this with respect, is that we start looking at what the rest of the market offers. And I'd rather not do that, but I'd rather do that than have a service event in February, because someone made a budget decision in October. He paused again. You understand what I'm saying? I do, she said. His voice warmed slightly, the way it did when the hard part of a conversation was past. How's the Chicago winter treating you? Cold, she said. Always is, he said. Talk soon. He hung up. Vivian set her phone on her desk and sat very still for a moment. $90 million. And Charles had called her personally which meant he wanted the conversation on record between the two of them, which meant the procurement outreach that followed would be shaped by this call, which meant the renewal was not, as she had assumed, stable guaranteed event it had appeared to be 3 months ago. She pulled up the client files. Whitfield Industrial, Cartwright Distributing, Beacon Wholesale Group, North Central Freight Partners. 4 accounts. Combined value, $212 million annually. All 4 running on North Star optimized corridors. All 4 now flagged in some form as requiring additional relationship management in the wake of Ethan's departure. She had been watching this number for 3 weeks. She had been telling herself it was manageable that client relationships were built on organizational capability, on individual employees. North Star, the technology would continue operating through the transition period. The institutional strength of Redmont Freight Group was larger than any single person's presence within it. Yes, that's Vint. Charles Whitfield's phone call was the data point that suggested this was not entirely accurate, and 4 data points in 3 weeks was no longer a pattern she could rationalize away. She called a board meeting for the following Thursday. The board of directors of Redmont Freight Group consisted of 7 people, including 2 independents who had been appointed during the expansion period and who had a professional distance from the day-to-day operations that made their questions, when they asked them, particularly uncomfortable to answer. One of the independent directors was a woman named Ellen Foss, who had spent 20 years in enterprise technology before transitioning to board service. She was 67 years old, dressed with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had stopped trying to look impressive and had arrived at something better, which was looking considered. She asked questions with the efficiency of someone who had sat on enough boards to know exactly which questions revealed the most. Vivian presented for 40 minutes. She was thorough and honest in ways she might choose cannot have been if she'd had more options, because when you were in a position where the board was going to find out the truth regardless, presenting it yourself was always strategically superior to having it presented for you. She covered the licensing situation, the client exposure, the operational corrections in Memphis and Reno, the commercial negotiations in progress, the revised Q4 projection. She covered all of it without deflection or excessive qualification, which was harder than it sounded when you were 30 years old, and the numbers on the screen represented a significant portion of your professional reputation. When she finished, Ellen Foss looked at the summary slide for a moment. The North Star IP was always held by Marlowe Systems, Ellen said. Yes, Vivian said, and this was disclosed to the board when you assumed the CEO role. It was in the briefing materials, Vivian said. She did not say, I didn't read that section carefully enough. She didn't need to. The implication was clear enough, and Ellen Foss was not a person who needed things twice. No. What's the status of the commercial negotiation? Ellen asked. Paul Greer is in conversation with Sandra Cho, Marlowe Systems attorney, Vivian said. Have 61 days remaining in the transition period. The conversations are measured. Measured, one of the other directors repeated. They're not in a hurry, Vivian said, which was the honest version of measured. A board member named Howard Kraft, who had a background in operations and who had been on the Redmont board since Gerald's time, leaned forward slightly. Is there any possibility of Marlowe returning to an employee capacity? Vivian said, You've confirmed that? I've spoken with him directly, Vivian said. It's not a possibility. Howard looked at the table. What would a fair market license cost, in your estimate? Paul, who was sitting along the wall in the role of legal counsel to the meeting, answered this one, because it was his territory. Based on comparable enterprise routing licenses at Redmont scale, Sandra Cho's team has indicated informally, not as an opening position, a range that is approximately 4 to 5 times what we've been paying under the original arrangement. The room absorbed this, which was below market, Ellen said. Was not a question. Significantly below market, Paul confirmed. Yes, he'd intervened. The original terms were structured to provide stability for both parties during what was essentially a startup integration. never intended to reflect long-term commercial value. We let them run for 6 years without renegotiating, Howard said. Yes, Paul said. Ellen looked at Vivian. This needs to get resolved before the end of the transition period. I'm aware, Vivian said. I don't mean resolved in the sense of a deal being signed, Ellen said. I mean resolved in the sense of us understanding what our operational infrastructure actually costs and budgeting accordingly, going into another fiscal year with a critical technology dependency sitting on terms that don't reflect reality. Understood, Vivian said. Ellen looked at the rest of the board and then back at Vivian. I want monthly updates on the commercial negotiation status. I want the client exposure managed proactively, not reactively. And she paused, choosing words with the care of someone who understood that words said in a board meeting had a different weight than words said in other rooms. I want a review of our major operational dependencies and the contractual arrangements that govern them. Comprehensive review. So we're not in this position again with a different technology or a different key relationship. Of course, Vivian said. One more thing, Ellen said. She looked at Vivian steadily, without unkindness but also without softness. The personnel decision that triggered this situation. The meeting where Mr. Marlowe was asked to leave. I want to understand what happened there. The room got the particular quality of rooms that have been waiting for a specific question to arrive. Vivian looked at Ellen Foss for a moment. She thought about what to say, and she thought about it quickly, because the board was watching her think about it. And in a room like this one, the thinking about it was as visible as the answer. I handled a disagreement about a budget decision in a way that was not appropriate, she said. I used personal information about a senior employee to challenge his professional objection. It was wrong. It had consequences I underestimated. Ellen held her gaze. What kind of personal information? His financial situation, Vivian said. His family responsibilities. The silence that followed was brief. Ellen Foss had been a professional for 40 years, and she had seen many things in that time. And she was not the kind of person who performed shock when she wasn't shocked. But something in her expression shifted not dramatically, visibly to everyone in the room. Vivian saw it, and it was the specific shift of a person who had just confirmed a suspicion they hadn't entirely wanted to be right about. I see, Ellen said. She said it quietly. She said nothing more on that specific subject, which was almost worse than if she had said more. The board meeting concluded. No one moved to take any immediate action against Vivian's position. She remained CEO. Her operational decisions remained in force. The company remained under her authority. At the end of the meeting, Ellen Foss asked Paul to stay behind, and she asked 3 of the other directors to stay as well, and she specifically did not ask Vivian. Vivian walked out of her own board meeting. At 30 years old, with 11,000 employees and a $1 billion balance sheet, and she waited in the hallway outside the conference room while her board had a conversation without her. She stood there for 22 minutes. When Paul came out, his reading glasses were pushed up onto his forehead, and he had the expression of a man who had been asked to deliver news he found genuinely unpleasant. They're implementing an oversight provision, he said quietly. Major operational decisions, senior personnel changes, significant contracts board approval required. Effective immediately. Vivian's jaw tightened slightly. For how long? Until the commercial situation is resolved and the client exposure is stabilized, Paul said. Ellen's language was demonstrable operational stability, which is subjective, Vivian said. Yes, Paul said, intentionally. She looked at the closed conference room door. My bonus, she said. Question. Suspended pending the Q4 review, Paul said. He said it the way he said everything difficult cleanly, without decorative language, because he respected her enough not to soften it past recognition. She nodded once. She walked back to her office. She closed the door, which she almost never did during the day, and she stood at her window looking at the lake, which was doing what it always did in November, being enormous and indifferent and gray, and not caring about any of this at all. She was 30 years old. She was still the CEO. The company was still hers in all the ways that the legal structure had said it. She had navigated worse than this. Technically, she had walked into this company at 26 and taken a struggling and turned it into something that generated press coverage and board praise and industry recognition. And she had done it without her father's direct involvement because her father had gotten sick 8 months after she took over and had spent most of the following year in and out of hospitals before recovering enough to return to the advisory role he now occupied at a comfortable distance. She had done hard things before, but standing at the window with the lake going gray in the November afternoon, she had to acknowledge quietly the specific way you acknowledged things that you were not going to put in any email or memo or official statement, that she had made a specific error about a specific person that had cost her in ways she could count and in ways she couldn't. And the one she couldn't count was the one that sat differently. She had looked at a man who had built something real, who had showed up every day for 6 years and done honest work until who depended on him and asked for nothing except to be taken seriously. And she had decided that his decency made him manageable, that his responsibility made him captive, his lack of performance, no expensive car, no tailored suits, no visible ambition in the currency she recognized, meant he had no power. She had been looking at the wrong currency the whole time. Storage unit in Addison. Ethan had set up something that was beginning to look less like a temporary workspace and more like an actual operation. He had rented 2 additional units adjacent to the first one and knocked through the temporary walls with the landlord's additional permission and a small additional monthly fee to create a connected space about the size of a generous studio apartment. He had a proper desk now, not a folding table, bought secondhand from an office liquidation in Schaumburg for $60. He had 3 monitors. He had a whiteboard on the wall that was covered in his particular style of notation, clean lines, compact, the kind of visual thinking that had always served him better than digital tools for the early-stage architecture work. He had hired 2 people. The first was a woman named Jody Park, who was 29 years old and had a master's degree in computational logistics from Northwestern, and who had applied for a position at Redmont 2 years earlier and been told that her skill set was impressive but that the role had been filled. Ethan had learned about her from a contact in the industry and had called her the week after he left Redmont. She had listened to his pitch for approximately 4 minutes and then said, "I read about North Star in an industry journal in 2020. I've been hoping someone would build the next version." Yes. The second was a man named David Reyes, who was 55 years old and had spent 30 years in enterprise software development and who was 3 years out from a company he'd co-founded and sold, living in Naperville with the particular restlessness of a technically gifted person with too much time and not enough problem. David had been a contact of Ethan's for years. They had met at an industry conference in 2019 and had stayed in occasional touch because they were the kind of people who recognized each other's thinking from a distance. Ethan had called him on the same week he'd called Jody. David had said, "How much equity?" Ethan had told him. David had said, "I'll need to see the architecture documentation." Ethan had sent it that night. David had called the next morning at 7:30 and said, "This is better than I expected." The 3 of them worked in the connected storage units 5 days a week, with the particular focused intensity of people who had something to prove to nobody except themselves, which was the best kind of intensity because it didn't need an audience to sustain itself. Sadie had come to see the space on a Saturday afternoon in early November because she had asked where Ethan was spending his days, and he had decided that showing her was simpler than explaining. She had stood in the middle of the main space. She had stood in the middle of the main space and looked at the whiteboards and the monitors and the second-hand desk and the extension cords running along the baseboard. It was not a glamorous setup by any measure. And she had said, "Is this where you're building your company?" Ethan said. She looked around again. She was 14, and she was at the age where she was trying to figure out how honest to be about what she thought, because honesty with parents was starting to carry a weight it hadn't carried at 10. "Kind of a storage unit, Dad." 3 storage units, he said. She looked at the whiteboard. Couldn't read most of it. It was logistics notation that required context, but she stood looking at it for a while with the expression she got when she was trying to understand something she didn't have enough information to fully read yet. "Is it going to work?" she said. He looked at her. She was asking the real question, not the polite version. The real question was, "Are we okay? Are you okay? Is this the right thing?" "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with the 14-year-old version of the same steady look he gave people, which was something she'd gotten from him or from Caroline, or from some combination of both of them that he would never be fully able to map. "'Kay," she said. She said it the way he'd said it to Paul, on the phone simply, and meaning it. She sat at his desk and did her homework while he worked at the whiteboard. It was in its way the best afternoon he'd had in a long time. Commercial negotiations between Sandra Cho and Paul Greer moved through November with the measured pace that Sandra had apparently decided was appropriate, and that Paul had apparently decided he was not in a position to accelerate. Because every time he tried to introduce urgency into the conversation, Sandra responded with information that reminded him, very professionally, why Redmont needed Marlowe systems more than Marlowe systems needed Redmont. The first number Sandra's team put on the table for the new licensing arrangement landed in Paul's email on a Monday and caused him to take his reading glasses off and set them on his desk and look at the ceiling for before putting them back on and reading it again. He brought it to Vivian within the hour. She looked at it. She was quiet. "Is it defensible?" she said. "Comparable licensing data suggests it's within the range of market rate," Paul said carefully. "It's not punitive. It's not the arrangement we've had," she said. Paul said it's not. She pushed the paper back across the desk toward him. "Counter at 10% below," she said, "and add the technical support hours into the base rather than as a separate line." Paul picked up the paper. "Vivian, I want to be candid about our leverage here." "Our leverage," she said. "We have 53 days, he said. And 3 of the 4 flagged client accounts have renewal decisions before February." She looked at him. "I know, Paul." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "He could have made this much harder," Paul said. It wasn't a prepared observation. It had the sound of something he'd been thinking about for a while and had decided, in this particular moment, to say. The transition documentation he submitted, the cooperation through the period. There were things he could have done that would have been damaging, and that would have been technically within his rights. Vivian looked out the window. The lake was dark and flat in the November light. "I know that too. It says something about him," Paul said. "It says something about me that he had to do it anyway," she said. Paul adjusted his glasses. He picked up the paper. "I'll counter by end of day." She nodded. After he left, she sat at her desk for a while without doing anything else. The city hummed outside her window, 47 floors below. The way cities moved, without reference to any single person's circumstances. Pause, without the decency to reflect back the weight of what any particular day had cost. She picked up her phone. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it down. There was nothing to call anyone about. Not really. The situation was what it was. The negotiations were proceeding. The board oversight was in place. The operational corrections were holding. The holiday shipping season was approaching with the implacable timing of something that answered to no one's internal recalibration. She had made choices, and the choices had made consequences, and the consequences were now what her days were made of. And you didn't call people about that. You just got up and worked inside the consequences until they became something else. They didn't. And either way, tomorrow the freight kept moving. Was the business. That had always been the business. Pulled the Q4 financial model back to the center of her screen and got to work. The counteroffer Paul sent to Sandra Cho on that Monday afternoon took 4 days to receive a response, which was 4 days longer than Paul had hoped, and exactly as long as Sandra had apparently decided it should take. Her reply was not a counter. It was a clarification. Sandra wrote, in the clean and precise language she used for everything, that Marlowe Systems appreciated Redmont's continued interest in a commercial arrangement, and that the licensing figure presented in the initial proposal reflected a genuine assessment of market rate for an enterprise routing system of Northstar's scope and performance history. She further noted that her client's position on the technical support structure, which Redmont had proposed folding into the base fee rather than billing separately, was that technical support represented a distinct service relationship that would scoped and priced independently, as it required dedicated engineering time that was not appropriately bundled with a licensing fee. Plain language. The number on the table was the number, the support was extra, and Marlowe Systems was not in a hurry. Paul read this twice and then called Sandra directly, which he had started doing in the third week of negotiations because emails were too slow for the pace the calendar was imposing on him. Sandra, he said when she picked up, help me understand the support position. Straightforward, Sandra said. She had the same quality Ethan had, a professional directness that was not unkind, but that did not decorate things it didn't need to decorate. The licensing fee covers access to Northstar and the right to run it on Redmont's infrastructure. Technical support integration issues, system updates, routing parameter adjustments, the kind of ongoing work Ethan was doing as an employee that's a separate engagement. We can scope it as a retainer or on a project basis, whichever works better for you, operationally. Rate for the retainer, Paul said. Sandra gave him a number. Paul wrote it down. He looked at what he had written. Thought about the board meeting and Ellen Foss and M. Foss and the word demonstrable and what it was going to cost to demonstrate anything by February. I'll bring it to the CEO, he said. Of course, Sandra said. Paul, I want to say something that's not a negotiating position. Shh. He paused. Go ahead. Ethan is not trying to hurt Redmont, she said. The numbers we're putting on the table are what the market would charge. We both know the original arrangement was below market for reasons that made sense in 2018. He's not extracting revenge. He's just charging what the thing is actually worth. I understand that, Paul said. I want to make sure Vivian understands it, Sandra said. Because there's a version of this conversation that goes sideways if it starts feeling personal on her end. And I'd rather it not go sideways. Paul was quiet for a moment. I'll make sure she understands. He brought the full picture to Vivian. That afternoon, the licensing number, the support retainer structure, the separate billing framework. He laid it out on paper in a single page because Vivian processed best from single pages with clear numbers, and he sat across from her while she read it. She read it twice. She put the paper down. It's not punitive, she said. Paul agreed. It's not. She looked at the number that represented what they had been paying for 6 years versus the number that represented what they would pay going forward. The difference between those two numbers was significant. It was the accumulated market rate that neither she nor her father before her had ever properly accounted for, because the original arrangement had been a handshake built on mutual benefit and neither party had updated it as the mutual benefit shifted in Redmont's direction. The board is going to need to approve this, she said. Yes, Paul said, under the new oversight provision. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Set up a call with Sandra for this week. I want to close this before the 40-day mark. She'll appreciate the timeline, Paul said. She'll appreciate that we're not wasting her client's time, Vivian said. That's different from appreciation. Paul almost smiled at that. He stood up. Then he stopped. Vivian, he said. He said it in the specific tone he used when he was going to say something outside his strictly defined professional role, which happened rarely enough that when it did, she paid attention. What, she said. Whatever happens with the negotiation, the board, the clients, the Q4 numbers. He paused. I want you to know that I think you've handled the fallout from this with more honesty than most people in your position would have. What you said to the board about the meeting, about using personal information against him. You didn't need to say that. You could have framed it differently. She looked at him. I'm not saying it to make you feel better, he said. I'm saying it because I've worked with executives for a long time, and the ones who don't learn from their mistakes tend to repeat them in ways that compound. You're not doing that, she was quiet. Thank you, Paul, she said. He left. She sat at her desk for a moment after the door closed, not doing anything. The lake was visible through her window, steel gray and enormous. She thought about what Paul had said, and she thought about what it meant that she found it harder to accept than the financial numbers. And she thought about why that was, and she arrived at an answer she didn't especially enjoy. Was that being told she was handling something well felt worse than the something itself, because it reminded her that she had created the something in the first place. She pushed back from the desk and got back to work. 41 days into the 90-day transition period, on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of December, Ethan's phone rang while he was standing at the whiteboard in the Addison workspace with a dry erase marker in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He almost didn't pick it up. He had developed a mild aversion to unknown Chicago numbers over they tended to be journalists. The story of his departure from Redmont had moved through industry networks faster than he'd expected. 2 trade publications had reached out for comment that he had declined to give. But he picked it up. Ethan Marlowe, he said. Ethan, a voice he hadn't heard in over a year. Older, carrying the slight roughness that settled into voices in their late 70s, but still with the particular quality of a man who had built something from nothing, and therefore spoke from a foundation most people didn't have. It's Gerald. Ethan set the dry erase marker down. Gerald, he said. Gerald Redmont was 78 years old and had, by most accounts that reached Ethan through industry contacts, recovered sufficiently from his health difficulties of the past few years to be functional and present, not in any official capacity at the company he'd built. He lived in Lake Forest. He played golf when the weather allowed. He had occasional lunches with people who wanted to reminisce about the logistics industry in its earlier era. I hope I'm not interrupting something important, Gerald said. Ethan said. He moved away from the whiteboard and sat at the second-hand desk. I've got time. I've been following the situation, Gerald said. There was no need to specify which situation. Not closely, Vivian doesn't keep me informed about operational matters. And that's appropriate. It's her company now. But people talk. They do, Ethan said. I want to say something to you, Gerald said. And I want to say it personally, because I think it deserves to be said that way. A pause, the pause of a man who had spent a career saying difficult things and had learned to take them seriously enough to slow down for them. What happened in that meeting? What she said to you about your situation, your daughter? It was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that, he said. I'm not calling to ask you to reconsider, Gerald said quickly. What your answer is. And frankly, I built a contract with you that gave you the right to have that answer. And I meant it when I built it. You were never supposed to be trapped here. Ethan looked at the whiteboard across the room. Jody and David were in the adjacent unit on a call with a potential infrastructure vendor, their voices a low murmur through the connecting wall. Why are you calling, Gerald? Ethan said. Not unkindly, just directly, the way Gerald had always spoken to him and had always seemed to appreciate in return. Because I made a mistake, Gerald said. When I stepped back, I handed Vivian the operational briefings, the financial position, the strategic context, all of it. But I didn't sit with her long enough on the relationship side. People who made the company run. I assumed she'd figure that out the way I did, through time and through getting it wrong a few times with lower stakes. A pause. Stakes turned out not to be as low as I assumed. Ethan didn't see anything. She's not a bad person, Gerald said. She pushes hard on things, and sometimes she pushes hard on the wrong things, and she doesn't always stop to understand why a person is doing what they're doing before she decides it's a problem. He paused. She learned some of that from me, if I'm being honest with myself. Gerald, Ethan said, none of this is something you need to fix. Gerald said, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm too old to fix things that are already broken. He stopped, started again. You were one of the best decisions I made for that company. Technology, yes, but also just who you are, how you work. I wanted you to know that I know that, even if some time went by where maybe it wasn't communicated clearly enough. Ethan sat with this for a moment. In the adjacent room, he could hear David laughing at something the vendor had said, the specific laugh of a man who was genuinely engaged with a problem, which was the best sound Ethan had heard in a professional context in quite a while. I'm building something good here, Ethan said, in case you were wondering. I assumed, Gerald said, and Ethan could hear the smile in it. Listen the negotiation. Don't give ground you don't have to give. The arrangement we built was too favorable to us for too long. That's the honest answer. You should be compensated correctly. Sandra's handling it, Ethan said. Good, Gerald said. She's sharp. I remember her from the original. She took 17 pages and turned it into 4. I've always respected that. Me too, Ethan said. They talked for a few more minutes, nothing of operational significance. Yes, he'd intervened. Just the kind of conversation two people had when they built something together and were trying to do the work of acknowledging that without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. When they finished, Gerald said, Take care of that daughter of yours. Every day, Ethan said. He sat at the desk for a while after hanging up. He picked up the dry erase marker and went back to the whiteboard. The holiday shipping season peaked in the 3rd week of December, and it was by the standards of what Ethan had predicted, and what Patricia Osei in Memphis had flagged, and what Roland Baxter had quietly feared manageable. Smooth, not without problems. The corrected reserve margins that Roland had restored to Memphis and Reno held through the highest volume days. There was a carrier relationship issue in the Harrisburg corridor on the 19th that required Roland personally on the phone for 3 hours. On a Sunday morning, which he managed with the particular determined competence of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that 3 hours on the phone on a Sunday was sometimes exactly what the job required. Patricia called him after it was resolved. We're going to make it through the month, she said. Looks like it, Roland said. The reserve margins made the difference, she said. For the record. I know, Roland said. It's on the record. She was quiet for a moment. How's it going up there? Roland considered what to say. We're working through it. Tell Vivian. Patricia stopped, started again. Tell whoever needs to hear it that the people down here in the centers are doing good work. They don't get told that enough. I'll tell her, Roland said. He did tell her later that week, and Vivian received it in the way she received things she needed to act on by picking up her phone and calling Patricia directly to say exactly that. It was a short call, 5 minutes, nothing dramatic. Patricia sounded slightly surprised and then not surprised, and when she hung up, she told 2 of her supervisors about it. And the information traveled through the Memphis Center, the way information traveled through places where people had been watching carefully to see what the people at the top were made of. It was a small thing, and it was also not nothing. Contract between Redmont Freight Group and Marlowe Systems was signed on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January, 47 days before the original 90-day transition period would have expired. It happened in Redmont's offices, not the 47th floor conference room, with the lake view and the original art, in a smaller, quieter conference room on the 32nd floor that was used for vendor meetings and external negotiations, which was exactly the category this meeting now occupied. Sandra Cho and Paul Greer had spent 6 weeks moving the terms to a place that both sides could commit to. The licensing fee was set at a number that reflected genuine market rate. Technical support was scoped as a separate retainer with clearly defined hours, deliverables, and escalation protocols. Yes, he'd intervened. The agreement ran for 3 years with a renewal option and a structured rate adjustment mechanism that prevented either party from being caught flat-footed the way the original arrangement had eventually caught both of them. There were protections for Marlowe Systems built into the language that Sandra had insisted on and Paul had accepted after reviewing comparable industry contracts and concluding that they were standard and reasonable. There was a clause that specified Redmont's obligations around data handling for the North Star architecture. There was a dispute resolution process that was fair and specific and that neither party expected to use, but that both parties were relieved to have in writing. It was, Paul told his associate attorney, after the signing, the cleanest commercial agreement he had negotiated in 11 years. He said this with the specific satisfaction of a lawyer who appreciated clarity above almost all other professional virtues. Ethan came alone. Sandra had offered to be there. He had told her it wasn't necessary she had done her work. The document was right. The signing was just the signing. He drove to Chicago from Addison in the Ford Explorer, which still had the cracked dashboard and still had the parking tag for the Redmont employee garage, which he would need to stop using after today. Yes, he'd intervened, and which he had not yet replaced with anything, because he hadn't been back to buildings since October, and there had been no reason to think about parking logistics until now. He found a public garage 2 blocks away. He paid the flat rate. He walked to the building through January air that was the specific Chicago cold of midwinter, kind that came off the lake, with the focused intention of making you understand that the city was serious about winter and expected you to be serious in return. The lobby security desk gave him a visitor badge. The elevator took him to 32. A Redmont assistant led him to the conference room, where Sandra had already told him the table, the chairs, and the document would be. The document was there. Paul was there. A young associate attorney was there, running the execution protocol marking pages, positioning signature lines, the efficient choreography of formal signing. Vivian was there. Ethan hadn't expected that. Sandra hadn't mentioned it. And show his surprise, because the surprise was minor, and because whatever Vivian's reasons were for being there, they were probably not reasons that required comment. Ethan, she said. Vivian, he said. They didn't shake hands. It wasn't a hostile omission, it was just that the gesture would have felt false, and both of them had apparently decided, discussing it. False gestures had done enough damage already. He sat down across from her, the way he had sat across from her in the Oak Street coffee shop, the way he had sat across from her in 100 meetings over 6 years. The table was smaller in this room than on 47. The view was of another building's windows. Paul walked them through the document efficiently. Both parties' counsel had reviewed and approved. This was the execution copy. Ethan read the key sections himself. He had read the full document twice already, but he read the key sections again because that was how he did things. And because the habit of reading what he was about to sign was one he had never abandoned, regardless of how thoroughly Sandra had reviewed it. He had questions on 2 points. Paul answered them. The answers were correct and consistent with what Sandra had communicated. Ethan nodded. Paul's associate placed the signature pages in order. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out Caroline's fountain pen. He had carried it with him to meetings at Redmont for 6 years. As a statement, he wasn't a person who made statements with objects, but because it wrote well, and because it was hers, and because he liked having it near him when he was doing something that required clear thinking. He uncapped it. He looked at the signature line. It said, in the clean font that legal documents used, Ethan Marlowe, founder and principal, Marlowe Systems, LLC. He signed. The pen moved across the page with the smooth, dark line it had always made since the first day he'd used it in the spare bedroom in Elmhurst, working through a routing problem at 2 a.m. while Caroline slept down the hall, and Sadie, who was 5 years old, had not yet developed the teenage scheduling opinions that would complicate his mornings 14 years later. He capped the pen. He slid the signature page to Paul's associate. Vivian signed her pages, the Redmont copies, executed by the CEO in her capacity as corporate officer, which was what the document required. Paul signed as witness. The associate collected everything with the careful efficiency of someone for whom this was process and procedure, which was correct. It was process and procedure. And it was also the moment when something that had started in a licensing discussion in a corporate office in 2018 between a man who had built something and a man who needed it became officially and legally and permanently, something different. Ethan put the cap back on the pen and put it back in his pocket. He looked across the table at Vivian. She looked, he thought, tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of someone who had been carrying a weight they hadn't expected for longer than they'd planned, and who was still carrying it and would be for a while yet, and who had decided that the carrying was part of what the situation required, and had accepted that even if they hadn't made peace with it entirely. She was 30 years old. She was still, whatever else had happened, running one of the country's larger logistics companies, and she had taken a serious institutional hit and absorbed it and continued functioning, which was not nothing. Ethan didn't hate her. He wasn't sure he'd ever hated her, even in the October conference room with her words about his mortgage and his daughter sitting in the air between them like something that had been thrown and couldn't be recalled. Anger, yes, the clean, quiet anger that came from being dismissed by someone who hadn't done the work of understanding what they were dismissing. But not hate. The transition technical documentation from Jody Park's team will be sent to your IT department by end of this week, he said. There's a new parameter set for the Q1 carrier optimization runs. Your system administrators will need to run the update before February 1st. Paul was writing this down. Vivian was watching Ethan. I'll make sure Roland has it, she said. Ethan nodded. He pushed his chair back. One thing, Vivian said. He looked at her. The offer I made you, the $1 million, the equity, the title. She held his gaze. I want you to know I understand now that it was the wrong currency. I understand what I was actually being told when you said no. She paused. She wasn't performing humility, which would have been easy enough for someone of her intelligence to perform convincingly. She was just saying a thing that was true and that she had decided he deserved to hear, said plainly. I should have understood that earlier. I didn't. Ethan stood. He held her gaze for a moment. I know, he said. He said it the same way. He'd said it in the coffee shop, not to wound her, not to close a door, just because it was the accurate thing, and he had never been good at saying inaccurate things even when they would have been kinder. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. You take care of the company, Vivian, he said. There are a lot of people depending on it. He walked to the door. He opened it. The hallway of the 32nd floor was quiet, an ordinary carpet, overhead lights, a water cooler near the elevator. Nothing like the 47th floor's deliberate architecture of importance. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button. While he waited, he heard from somewhere on the floor behind him the faint sound of the conference room door opening and closing. Nothing. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. He pressed lobby. The doors closed on the building he had worked in for 6 years and left in a cardboard box 3 months ago and returned to today as someone else, entirely not someone transformed, not someone vindicated in any dramatic sense, just someone who had done the honest thing at every step and had arrived, finally at a place where the honest thing and the right thing were the same, and the document in his pocket proved it. Walked through the lobby. No, past the 2 composed women at the reception desk, past the security station, where the guard gave him the practiced nod of someone who processed visitors all day and had no context for who this particular visitor was, out through the glass doors into the January cold. His breath made a small cloud. The wind off the lake pushed against him with its usual indifference. Pulled his jacket tighter and walked the 2 blocks to the public garage. He paid the exit fee $8 for 3 hours, which was not cheap, but was less than the executive dining room sandwich. And this thought occurred into him, and found it almost funny, in the way things were sometimes almost funny when you were on the other side of something difficult, and had enough distance to see it slightly sideways. He drove home. On the way, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He waited until the next red light to look at it. A text from Sandra. Paul just confirmed receipt of all executed copies. We're done. Congratulations. He set the phone back down. The light turned green. He drove home through January Chicago, past the bare trees and the gray storefronts, and the people moving quickly through the cold with their shoulders up and their heads down. Through the ordinary unremarkable landscape of a Thursday afternoon that looked like every other Thursday afternoon, except that was not for him, not today. Sadie was at school until 3:15. He had 4 hours. He thought about what to make for dinner. Something that required actual cooking, not just reheating. She had mentioned twice in the past week that he had been relying on leftovers more than usual, and she had said it with the particular tone she used when she was noting something without criticizing it, which was considerate of her and which he appreciated, and which also meant he should probably make the pasta dish she liked. One with the Italian sausage and the peppers that took about 45 minutes, and that he had learned from Caroline's mother years ago and had never quite perfected, but kept making anyway, because it tasted like something worth continuing to attempt. He stopped at the grocery store on the way home. He bought Italian sausage, peppers, a can of crushed tomatoes, garlic, and a loaf of bread because they were out of bread. He paid. He drove home. He parked in the driveway of the house in Elmhurst, which still had leaves he hadn't raked in the back, which would probably just have to wait until spring at this point, which was fine. He put the groceries away. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment with a glass of water, the quiet house in the January afternoon light coming through the kitchen window at the low slant that January had, and he held the glass with both hands and breathed. Contract was signed. The pen was in his pocket. The company was his, entirely and legally and without ambiguity. And in 4 hours, his daughter would come through the door and drop her backpack in the hallway instead of in her room, which was something he reminded her about on a fairly regular basis without meaningful results. And she would say, "What's for dinner?" before she said anything else, because she was 14 and food was immediate and everything else could wait 30 seconds. And he would tell her it was the pasta thing. And she would say yes in the specific way she said yes to things she was genuinely pleased about. And they would eat dinner together at the table in the kitchen of the house where he had built the first version of what he was now building again. Better this time. Yes intervened, and the day would end the way good days ended when you weren't watching for them quietly, without announced in the middle of something ordinary. He got up and started cooking. February came to Chicago the way February always came, without apology, without transition, as if November and December and January had merely been rehearsals for the real thing. Cold settled into the city with a permanence that made people stop checking the forecast, because the forecast was always the same, and knowing it in advance didn't make it easier to stand at a bus stop in it. Ethan drove to Addison every morning through this cold in the Ford Explorer, with the heat running and the radio on low, a morning news program he half listened to and half ignored, the way people listened to things they wanted in the background without wanting to be fully inside them. The drive took 22 minutes. He knew every light on the route. Marlowe Systems, by the second week of February, had outgrown the 3 connected storage units. Dramatically, it wasn't like the walls were closing in. But Jody had hired a junior engineer named Marcus Tran, 24 years old, and recently out of a graduate program at Purdue, who had shown up for his first day and had stood in the main workspace and said, with the specific honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften first impressions, "This is a storage unit." 3 storage units, Ethan had said. Marcus had said, and had sat down at the folding table they'd set up as his workstation and opened his laptop and gotten to work, which was the correct response and which told Ethan something useful about him. The space was real. 4 people, 3 monitors each, a whiteboard that had been entirely rewritten 6 times since October, a printer that jammed on anything heavier than standard paper, the low-grade hum of the adjacent unit's ventilation system that they had all learned to hear without hearing. It was time to find something better. David found it a commercial space in a converted industrial building in Oak Park, 800 square feet on the 2nd floor, big windows facing west, exposed brick on 2 walls, a freight elevator that was unreliable enough to be character building, but functional enough to be usable. The monthly rent was more than the storage units, but less than it would have been 6 months ago when the market had been tighter. They signed a 12-month lease. On the Friday afternoon they moved in. Ethan carried his second-hand desk up the freight elevator in 2 pieces, with David holding the other end and Marcus managing the elevator controls with the slightly nervous attention of someone operating machinery he didn't fully trust. Jody had been there since 9 that morning, measuring the wall space for the whiteboard and running an Ethernet cable along the baseboard with the precise, unhurried competence she brought to everything physical. By 4 o'clock, the space was functional. Not finished, there were boxes still stacked near the freight elevator, and the overhead lights were the wrong color temperature, and there was a water stain on the ceiling in the northwest corner that the landlord had promised. It was old and stable, and probably was but functional. Operational, the kind of place where real work could happen. David stood in the middle of the main room and looked around with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he'd built and finding it acceptable, which from David was approximately equivalent to enthusiasm. "Jitter," he said. "Much better," Jody said. Marcus looked at the exposed brick. "I like the brick." Ethan stood at the west window and looked at Oak Park in the February afternoon, the bare trees in the street below, and the particular quality of late winter light that was exhausted and thin but was undeniably, yet still light, still present, still moving in the direction of something warmer even when it didn't feel like it. He thought about the storage unit in Addison, where this had started, the folding table, the extension cords, the second-hand chair he'd bought at the same liquidation place as the desk. He thought about October, about the cardboard box, about driving away from the parking garage on level 3 with Sadie's photo wrapped in a paper towel at the bottom of the box and Caroline's pen in his jacket pocket. He hadn't known exactly, on that drive home, what this would look like. And it was necessary. He had known what he was building toward in the broad sense. But this specific room, these specific people, this specific view of Oak Park on a February Friday, he hadn't been able to picture this exactly. You never could, which was both the difficulty and the point. "Who wants food?" he said. "I'm buying." They ordered Thai from a place 2 blocks away and ate it sitting on the floor of the new office because the chairs weren't set up properly yet, which was not dignified, but was entirely comfortable in the way that things were comfortable when the people you were chosen were people you had chosen to work with, and they had chosen to work with you, and the floor was clean enough. David told a story about a move-in at the first company he'd co-founded 20 years ago, where they'd driven a rented truck through a doorway that was 2 inches narrower than the truck and had solved the problem by removing the door from its frame, which had taken 4 hours and had resulted in a structural question about the door frame that they had never formally resolved and which the building owner had never noticed, because the door had gone back onto its hinges at a slightly different. Yes, he'd intervened, angle, and the building owner had been the kind of person who didn't look closely at things that appeared to be in their approximate correct position. Jody laughed at this. Marcus laughed at this. Ethan ate his pad thai and laughed at this, and thought about how long it had been since he had laughed at something in a work context without the laughter feeling like a performance or a pressure release. This was just laughter. A story about a truck and a door frame and 4 hours of unnecessary engineering work. It was the best kind of funny. They cleaned up. They set up the last of the monitors. They went home. Ethan drove back to Elmhurst and picked Sadie up from her friend Daniella's house, where she had been since 3, and where she emerged into the cold with a jacket she hadn't zipped up, in the way that teenagers treated cold as a theoretical concept that didn't apply to them personally. "Zip your jacket," he said when she got in the car. "I'm fine," she said. "Zip it, or I'll zip it for you." She zipped it. "How's the new office?" "Good," he said. "Better." She looked at him across the console in the specific evaluating way she had lately, the way that was part of being 14, and figuring out how much of what adults said was the truth, and how much was the version of the truth they presented. 'Cause they thought it was what you needed to hear. "Really," he said. "We ate on the floor." She considered this. Why? Chairs weren't set up. That's kind of a disaster, she said. It was fine, he said. It was good, actually. She seemed to accept this. She looked out the window. After a moment, she said, Daniela wants to know if I can come to her family's lake house in the spring. When in the spring? April. Like spring break. Who else is going? Her family. Maybe 2 other friends. He thought about this. He thought about the logistics of it, Daniela's family, who he had met twice and who had seemed entirely reasonable. A lake house in April. Sadie at 14. He thought about the version of himself from October, the version who had been calculating whether financial reality would force him back into a building he'd walked away from. The version who had been holding things together with the specific, determined tiredness of someone who had been doing it alone for long enough that the tiredness had become invisible through familiarity. That version of him would have said yes without hesitation, because he would have felt the pressure of wanting to give her something uncomplicated when everything else was complicated. This version of him said, let me meet the parents properly first. Invite them over. Sadie turned to look at him. Really? If you want to spend a week at someone's lake house, I want to have a real conversation with the people running it. A wave in the driveway. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, okay, I'll ask Daniela. Someone feigned. She said it in a tone that was not quite surprised, but was something adjacent to it, the tone of someone recalibrating slightly, noticing that the person they were talking to had more presence than they'd recently expected. Ethan drove home through the dark winter streets and thought that this, too, was something he'd gotten back without fully recognizing. It was gone, the particular kind of present attention that had been spread thin for too long in too many directions, and was now slowly gathering back into something more solid. The first week of March brought something Ethan hadn't anticipated in its specific form, though he should have anticipated it in some form, because things that build genuinely tend to attract attention, and attention tends to arrive through the channels you least expect. An email came to the Marlowe Systems general inbox from a company called Stellargate Logistics, which was a regional freight and warehousing operation based in Indianapolis with annual revenue of approximately $400 million. The email was from their vice president of operations, a woman named Renata Voss, and it was direct and specific in the way emails from operations. People tended to be no preamble, flattery, just, we've heard about North Star. We have a routing inefficiency problem. We want to understand what a conversation looks like. Jody brought it to Ethan on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice. How'd they hear about us? Kevin Chu at Cartwright Distributing, I think, Jody said. Kevin Chu, whose account director had called Diane Torres at Redmont back in November to ask about Ethan's departure, and who had since, apparently, mentioned North Star and its architect to people in his industry network. The information economy of logistics was, as Ethan had known for years, built largely on exactly these kinds of connections, the right person telling the right person about the right solution. Set up a call, Ethan said. The call with Renata Voss happened on a Thursday. She was 44 years old, had a direct Midwestern manner. Yes, he'd intervened and had spent 20 minutes of a 40-minute call asking specific technical questions about North Star's routing parameter architecture that told Ethan she had done her homework before picking up the phone. He answered each question without simplifying it or overselling it. When she asked what it could do for a network the size of Stellargate's, he gave her an honest range rather than a best-case projection. I appreciate that you didn't tell me it would solve everything, she said at the end of the call. It won't solve everything, Ethan said. It'll solve the routing inefficiency. You probably have other problems, too. We definitely have other problems, she said. Kay, can you get me a proposal by the end of the month? Yes, he said. He told David and Jody about it after the call. David looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he did when he was calculating something with his eyes and then said, if Stellargate comes on, we need one more engineer. I know, Ethan said. Marcus knows somebody from his program, Jody said. I'll ask him. This was how it went. With fanfare, with a dramatic announcement, with the steady accumulation of one real thing after another a call, a proposal, engineer, gut, a better space, a longer lease, wider network. He's one problem solved that led someone to mention you to someone else who had a different problem you could also solve. It was work. It was just work. It was the best kind. Redmont Freight Group released its full-year financial results in the second week of March. The results were, by the standards of what the quarter before peak season had threatened, acceptable. The results Vivian had promised the board in October. The margin improvement she had projected hadn't materialized the operational corrections, and the new licensing terms had absorbed it. But the catastrophic service event that Ethan's risk assessment had warned against had not materialized either. No, and the 4 major client accounts that had been flagged in November had been retained. Whitfield Industrial had renewed. Charles Whitfield had called Vivian personally to confirm it, in the same direct manner he'd used in November, and had said, "Your operations team did good work through the holiday season." Patricia Ossie specifically. I've heard her name from 2 of my logistics managers. Vivian had noted this, and had then called Patricia again, directly, and had told her that her work had been noticed at a level above the organizational chart, which was a more specific thing to say than good job, and which Patricia had received with the composure of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, to be seen accurately. Cartwright Distributing had renewed at the same terms. Central Freight Partners had renewed after a renegotiation that cost Redmont a 3% rate reduction on one quarter but preserved the relationship, which Roland had accepted as the right trade. Beacon Wholesale Group was the difficult one. Their account director had used the period of uncertainty around Northstar as leverage to extract better pricing, and the renewal they'd signed reflected that it was a win for Beacon and a margin loss for Redmont, which Vivian had accepted because the alternative was losing the account entirely, and losing it would have been the wrong signal at the wrong time. The board reviewed the full-year results and determined that the oversight provision implemented in November would remain in place through the second quarter, at which point they would reassess. Ellen Foss communicated this to Vivian in the way Ellen communicated everything directly, without cushioning, with the specific addendum that the board considered the commercial negotiation to have been handled correctly once it had been engaged seriously, and that the operational corrections in Memphis and Reno had demonstrated appropriate responsiveness to expert concern. What Ellen did not say, but what the board's private notes reflected, was that the assessment of the initial personnel decision remained unresolved in the sense that it had happened, and its consequences had been real, and the oversight provision was partly a structural acknowledgement of that fact, rather than purely a financial governance measure. Boards did not often say this part out loud, but they wrote it down in the places where they kept the institutional memory of why certain procedures existed, and it would be there for the next person who needed to understand it. Vivian absorbed the Q2 oversight extension without comment in the board meeting. She presented her plans for the remainder of the year with the same thoroughness she brought to every board presentation, and the plans were good grounded in operational reality, in a way that October's presentation had not been, on margins that were honest rather than aspirational. Ellen Foss asked 3 questions. All 3 were answered correctly. After the meeting, Yips, walking back to her office from the conference room on 47, Vivian passed the hallway where, on an October afternoon, she had watched a man walk to the elevator with a cardboard box. She didn't stop, but she noticed the passing in the specific way that places where important things happened retained a quality that was felt rather than named, and the noticing was its own small accounting of what that moment had cost. She went back to work. On a Tuesday morning in April, Ethan returned to Redmont's offices one final time. It was transition paperwork, the formal completion of the Northstar technical handoff, documentation that needed physical signatures and that Paul had asked him to come in for, rather than handling by mail, because Paul was a person who believed certain things deserved to be done in person, and Ethan had agreed, without pushing back on it, because he thought Paul was probably right. Parked in a public garage 3 blocks away. He wore a jacket he'd bought in February. Not new, but newer than the ones he'd been wearing. A dark, navy thing that fit properly, and that Sadie had expressed approval of in the specific restrained way she expressed approval of his clothing choices. The lobby security desk gave him a visitor badge. The elevator button he pressed was 47, because Paul's office was on 47, and because the transition documentation was in Paul's office, and that was where he needed to go. The doors opened on the 47th floor. The floor was the same. Polished concrete, the art on the walls, the reception area, with the two composed women at the desk. The view from the east-facing windows was the lake, which in April had changed from the iron gray of winter to something less definite, not quite blue, quite green, somewhere in between, the color of water, remembering what warmth felt like. He walked to Paul's office. They spent 40 minutes on the documentation. Paul had everything organized in the way Paul organized everything chronological, tabbed, each signature location marked with a small flag. Ethan read what he needed to read and signed what he needed to sign, and asked 2 questions and received 2 accurate answers. When they finished, Paul said, "That's everything." "Good," Ethan said. Paul looked at him over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who had one more thing to say and was deciding how to say it. "I want to tell you something. Professionally, as someone who watched this from start to finish." Ethan waited. "The transition documentation you submitted when you left," Paul said. "In October. You spent how long on that?" "A few months building it," Ethan said. "The last part was the day I left. It was the most complete transition document I've seen in 11 years here," Paul said. "You didn't have to do that. You had every right to leave with less, and it would have created significant additional problems for the company." He paused. "I've always thought that what a person does when they don't have to do it tells you more about them than what they do when they're obligated." Ethan picked up his copy of the signed documents. "It was the right thing," he said. "People here, depending on those systems. Wasn't their fault what happened in the meeting." Nodded slowly. They shook hands. Ethan walked out of the office. He was heading toward the elevator when he passed his former desk. He had known he would pass it. It was on the direct route, and he had not spent any particular time thinking about how it would feel, which was probably the right approach. Someone else was sitting there now. A young man, he's maybe 27, with the concentrated expression of someone deep in a problem. A plant on the corner of the desk in a ceramic pot. 2 photographs facing away from Ethan so he couldn't see who was in them. Coffee cup with the lid on. A laptop sticker he couldn't read from this angle. The desk was entirely different from the desk Ethan had occupied, in the way that spaces absorbed the people who inhabited them and then released them and absorbed someone else. Ethan stopped for a moment. Not long, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough to see the desk clearly and to recognize that it was no longer his in any sense that mattered, and that this was correct, and that he was glad it wasn't empty. He continued walking. The elevator was waiting. He stepped in, pressed lobby. As the doors began to close, he saw Vivian. She was at the far end of the hallway, coming out of the conference room, the big one, with the lake view, where the budget meeting had happened, where the risk assessment had been dismissed. Everything that had followed had its origin. She had a tablet in one hand and was talking to Roland, who was walking beside her, and saying something she was listening to with the particular quality she had when she was actually listening rather than waiting to respond. She looked up. The elevator doors were almost closed. Eyes met for a moment through the narrowing gap. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. There wasn't enough time for words, and there wasn't really anything that words needed to do. The moment was what it was. 2 people who had been in the same story, looking at each other across a hallway through a closing door, each of them carrying what they'd learned from it, each of them heading somewhere the other one wasn't going. The doors closed. He rode down to the lobby. He walked out through the glass doors and into April, which in Chicago was genuinely trying, still cold in the mornings, but with a quality in the afternoon light that was different from February's exhausted thin light. Something with more angle to it, more reach. the kind of light that landed on the sidewalk and the buildings and the lake, with the suggestion of intent rather than just duration. He walked the 3 blocks to the parking garage. He took the elevator to level 2, where he'd parked, and he found the Ford Explorer, and he sat in it for a moment before starting it. He thought about the first time he'd driven to this building, years ago, not as an employee yet, as a person coming to meet Gerald Redmond about a licensing arrangement for a piece of software he'd built in a Eve's bedroom. He'd been nervous that morning, in the specific way of someone who has something real and is about to find out whether the real thing translates. He had parked in a public garage then, too. He had worn a good shirt and the Seiko watch that Caroline had recently given him. He was wearing the same watch right now. The leather strap had been replaced twice. Face was the same. He started the car. He drove out of the parking garage into the April afternoon and turned south toward Oak Park, toward the office with the exposed brick and the west-facing windows where Jody and David and Marcus were currently working on the Stellargate proposal, which was due at the end of the week, and which was good, genuinely good, built on honest numbers and accurate projections and the kind of thinking that Ethan had spent his entire career doing, and that was finally being done in a place that was entirely his. The Stellargate proposal went out on Friday. Renata Voss called on Monday. She had 2 questions about the implementation timeline and 1 about the carrier data integration protocol, and Ethan answered all 3 with the same directness he'd used in the first call. And at the end she said, "We want to move forward. Have your attorney reach out to our legal team." Ethan called Sandra. Sandra called Stellargate's legal team. The world continued in the direction it was going. Is a particular kind of person who gets mistaken throughout their life for someone who has no options. Nope. They drive the ordinary car. They pack the ordinary lunch. They wear the watch that means something to them rather than the watch that signals something to others. They stay in the difficult room longer than they need to because they believe the work matters and the people depending on the work matter. And this staying gets mistaken for inability to leave. The mistake is logical from a certain angle. People with options perform their options. They make sure you know the exit exists because knowing you could leave is part of how you establish your value in rooms where value is measured in leverage. But there is another kind of value and another kind of person. The person who stays because they have chosen to stay is different from the person who stays because they have no choice. And the difference is invisible right up until the moment it isn't. Right up until the moment they stand and pick up their cardboard box and walk to the elevator. And you realize too late, always too late in these stories, that the loyalty you were counting on was never servitude. It was a decision. And decisions can be unmade. Ethan Marlowe was 32 years old, and he was a widower and a father and a founder, and he drove a cracked Davbird SUV, and he packed his own lunch, and he wore the watch his wife had given him, and he had never, not once in 6 years, been trapped. Yes, he'd intervened. He had been choosing. When Vivian Redmond looked at those facts and saw dependence, she was doing something that powerful people do more often than they recognized. She was reading someone else's life through the framework of her own, where money was power, and choices were demonstrated by spending and staying, meant you had nowhere else to go. She wasn't a villain. She was a person who had grown up in a specific kind of world and had learned its specific kind of logic and had applied it too confidently to a person it didn't fit. She was brilliant and she was flawed and she was 30 years old, and the oversight provision and the suspended bonus and the narrowed authority were not ultimately what her year had cost her most. What it had cost her most was its lesson in itself, the understanding that she had possessed something that she hadn't known how to value, and that by the time she understood its value, the possessing was over. She would learn from it. The evidence, the board meetings handled with honesty, the direct calls to Patricia, the acknowledgement to Ethan in the 32nd floor conference rooms, suggested she was already learning from a mistake, and not having made it are different. And the distance between them doesn't close no matter how well you study the gap. This is the truth that doesn't arrive on the day everything falls apart. It arrives later, quietly. Yes, in Fiend, In the middle of ordinary days when there's nothing dramatic happening and you find yourself thinking about a moment that seemed like a small decision at the time and turned out to be the decision that defined what followed. Vivian would have those days. She was already having them. Ethan, on an April Tuesday, driving back to Oak Park with the signed documents in his bag and the lake somewhere to his east and Sadie in school until 3:15, and a Stellargate proposal going out on Friday and dinner to figure out and a lease to renew in 12 months, and a company to build and a daughter who was going to need 1,000 things from him in the coming years that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with presence. Ethan was just driving. The watch was on his wrist. Pen was in his jacket pocket. The company was his. He was not vindicated. Exactly, vindication was a word for people who had been waiting to be proven right in a public way, and Ethan had never been waiting for that. He had been waiting, in the specific way of people who are genuinely good at what they do, for the conditions that allowed him to do it fully and honestly, and without apologizing for the shape of his life. Those conditions existed now. They existed in the Oak Park office with the exposed brick and the unreliable freight elevator and the 4 people who showed up every day because they believed in the work. They existed in the signed contract with its fair numbers and its honest terms sitting in his bag in the back seat. They existed in the watch and in the pen and in the fact that on certain mornings he dropped his daughter at school and watched her walk through the doors with her backpack slightly lopsided the way she always wore it. And then he sat in the parking lot for a moment before driving away, because he was lost or uncertain, but because some mornings the ordinary miracle of getting to be there for it needed a moment before it could be set aside and allowed to just be the quiet background of a life being well lived. He would not have traded this for the corner office. He had never wanted the corner office. He had wanted to build something true, to raise his daughter, and to work with people who took the work seriously. Yes, he'd intervened, and to go home at the end of the day with the knowledge that he had said honest things and done honest work and had not pretended the numbers said something they didn't, to make someone comfortable. He had all of that now. Not perfectly, nothing was perfect, and he had stopped expecting it to be around the same time he learned that the attempting was the point, not the arriving. Pasta dish was still not quite right, but it tasted like something worth continuing to attempt. The freight elevator in Oak Park was still unreliable. His mornings were still complicated in the ways that mornings were complicated when you were doing everything alone. No, and the 14-year-old you were raising had started having opinions about breakfast that were difficult to reconcile with the time available. Complicated was his. All of it, the good and the difficult, and the days that worked and the days that didn't, was entirely, completely, yes, without negotiation or qualification, his. He turned onto the street that led to the Oak Park office. Parked. He took the stairs. The freight elevator was making a sound today that suggested the stairs were the right choice. He opened the door to the office, and the smell of coffee and the sound of Jody on a call, and David typing at the speed he typed when he was deep in. Something reached him all at once. The specific ambient quality of a place where real work was happening. He set his bag down. He hung up his jacket. He went to the whiteboard and uncapped the marker and stood looking at the problem he'd been working on before he left that morning, a routing parameter question for the Stellargate network that had been bothering him for 2 days, and he looked at it fresh, the way you sometimes could look at something fresh after being away from it for a few hours, and he saw something he hadn't seen before. He started writing. Outside the west-facing windows, April was doing its uncertain best with the light, pushing it through the bare branching trees and across the rooftops of Oak Park. And somewhere across the city, his daughter was in a classroom learning something or pretending. No. Someone intervened. And somewhere on the 47th floor of a glass tower, the freight was moving and the systems were running, and the numbers were being read by people who were trying, as people always tried, to understand what the numbers actually meant. Ethan wrote on the whiteboard. The marker moved cleanly. Problem, he could see now, had a solution. It had been there the whole time.